Hello. We begin our final exploration of Hamlet where we left off Tuesday in Act 4. But now, after spending so much time in Hamlet's perspective and in his mind, we find that he is absent. Okay? Hamlet, you'll recall, was dispatched to England by Claudius, ostensibly to deliver messages to the English king, but secretly to be killed there on Claudius's written order, sent with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Now, the journey that Hamlet is on is going to have a transformative effect on him when he returns at the start of Act 5. But for the last three scenes in Act 4, Hamlet is out of Denmark and off stage. Now, Scene 5 of Act 4 belongs to Ophelia, who we discover has been driven to insanity by the combination of her father's death, Hamlet's role in it, and Hamlet's cruelty toward her. When a courtier tells Gertrude of Ophelia's mental breakdown, Gertrude says, "I will not speak with her." Why? Well, probably because Gertrude feels guilty, feels at least partly responsible for the death of Polonius that has deranged Ophelia and is thus not willing to see someone who she knows she has contributed to causing such agony. After all, Gertrude knew that Polonius was eavesdropping on her conversation with Hamlet behind the arras, and she knows that Polonius was killed because Hamlet was trying to avenge his father's death and her infidelity and thought that it was Claudius. So she feels uneasy, she feels guilty. In an aside to herself, Gertrude refers to her own, quote, sick soul, in which, quote, guilt spills itself, even though she tries to contain it. She can't. Well, even before Ophelia arrives, a messenger reports that the young woman has been beating her breast, making weird winks and nods and strange tick-like gestures, and speaking things that make but, quote, half sense. In short, she seems distracted and almost babbling. But, like some of the remarks that Hamlet makes in his antic disposition, in his feigned madness, there are moments of sense-making and truth in Ophelia's genuine madness. When she enters, Ophelia is singing about the two causes of that madness. First, Polonius's mysterious death and the disappearance of his body, and his hasty funeral, which seems so strange and troubling. She sings, "He is dead and gone, lady, he is dead and gone," and then later says, "I cannot choose but weep to think that they would lay him in the cold, cold ground." She sings these lines. She sings everything at this point lyrically. "Good night, ladies, good night, sweet ladies, good night," though who she's talking to, of course, no one knows. Now, Ophelia also feels aggrieved and betrayed by Hamlet's cruelty, by what we saw was his sexual humiliation of her, and by his casting her off so brutally. And she sings of this indirectly when, quite against her modest character, she intones a dirty song about a maid who is tricked and diverginated by a young man on Valentine's Day, the man that she loved. In this song, the maid shows up at the man's window on Valentine's Day when the legend held it that the first woman a man sees on Valentine's Day is the one that he will marry. The young woman hopes she'll see him at the window and marry him, probably very much as Ophelia had hoped that Hamlet would marry her, despite her brother's and her father's disapproval. The song she sings goes like this: "Tomorrow is Valentine's Day, all in the morning betide, and I, a maid at your window to be your Valentine. Then up he rose and donned his clothes and up to the chamber door, let in the maid that out a maid never departed more." And she continues, "Young men will do it. If they come to it, by cock they are to blame." Well, the bawdiness of this song would have made Ophelia blush in the past, but in her deranged state, she now sings it. And as she does so, she is, as she is described, divided from herself and her fair judgment. Thus, she laments in the kind of bawdy language that Hamlet had directed at her. Now, that statement, she's divided from herself, touches obliquely on one of the many philosophical questions that Shakespeare is raising in this play, and that is, what is the self? If one can be divided from the self, well, what is the thing that we're divided from? Earlier, Polonius had rather glibly told Laertes, to thy own self be true. But that's superficial advice because the self in this play is so often mysterious and elusive. In particular, we see how Hamlet struggles to know himself, constantly questioning who and what he is, just as he questions what reality is. Well, consider what Claudius says next regarding Ophelia. He speaks of her insanity as a poison of the mind. And, of course, the poison also that Laertes is putting in people's ears, or the people are putting in Laertes' ears with rumors about Polonius's death, these are two concerns of his, both of which he speaks of in the language of poison, a poisoned mind, and the way in which Laertes is being poisoned by the mob. But note that this language of poison that Claudius uses is really a reference to outgrowths of the poison that he originated in the play, when literally he poured a vial of poison in the ear of his late brother, King Hamlet. From that act of poisoning, all other poison and attendant corruptions in the play sprang, until Denmark is poisoned, corrupted, in Hamlet's words, a country that is possessed by things rank and gross in nature. Well, despite Claudius's efforts at control, the country has then been contaminated, like the body of the poisoned dead king, and like the poisoned soul of Claudius himself. The country reflects that state of poisoning and corruption. And the lies that Claudius tells throughout the play are a poison that he continues to pour into the ears of others, including his wife Gertrude, when he tells her that he has sent Hamlet away to England not to have him killed, but rather for Hamlet's own protection and to keep him from being prosecuted at home. Now, one manifestation of the ill health of Denmark, which always reflects the state of the king, is that anarchy seems to be rising in the streets. This is what Claudius refers to after Laertes has returned from Paris, learning of his father's death. When he returns from France to punish his father's killer, we're told, the rabble cry him Lord, and cry, we choose Laertes, shall be our king. Well, that kind of popular uprising, that kind of insurrection based on rumors about some foul play in Polonius's death that the mob feels may point to Claudius, that is a threat to Claudius's power as king. But in the face of that threat, consider how he finesses so brilliantly Laertes in dealing with this fiery, tempestuous, angry young man. First, he does so by waiting to tell Laertes that it was Hamlet who killed his father, not he, until after Gertrude has left. Okay? Note that Hamlet and Laertes are, by the way, in this sense, though antagonists, alike and akin in their drive to avenge the killer of their father. But there is one striking difference, I think we realize immediately, between the two of them. Whereas Hamlet had to disguise his intentions to kill Claudius, Laertes rushes headlong into the palace, ready to attack Claudius for his father's death. But I noted that Claudius is an extraordinarily skillful ruler, and he handles Laertes' aggression with remarkable tact and restraint, speaking to the young man calmly and hearing him out patiently. Thus, the king says, what is the cause, Laertes, that thy rebellion looks so giant-like? Let him go, Gertrude. Do not fear our person. There's such divinity doth hedge a king that treasons can but peep to what it would. God will always protect kings. Acts little what it would, acts little of his will. Tell me, Laertes, why art thou so incensed? Let him go, Gertrude. Let him approach. Let him demand his fill. Okay. Now, note, Laertes is enraged not just at the report that his father has been killed, but at the indignities that followed, things that seem to insult Polonius's memory, the lack of ceremony, the obscurity of his burial, even for a time, the inability perhaps to find his body. Thus he says, his means of death, his obscure funeral, no trophy, sword, or hatchment o'er his bones, no noble rite, no formal ostentation. This is unacceptable. This is an insult to his memory. Well, Claudius tells Laertes, quote, I am guiltless of your father's death. But he only explains that Hamlet is in fact his father's killer later in private, after Gertrude is away. Why? Well, understandably, he doesn't want to upset Gertrude, but he also obviously doesn't want Gertrude in any way to interfere in the way he is going to be using Laertes. Now, it's quite understandable that Laertes wants to know why Claudius did not arrest Hamlet for the crime of killing his father, if in fact, as Claudius says, that is the case. Why did you send him away instead? Why not imprison him? Why not prosecute him? Well, there are two reasons for this that Claudius cites. He says, the queen, Hamlet's mother, lives almost by his looks, and for myself, my virtue or my plague, be it either, which she is so conductive to my life and soul, that as the star moves not but in his sphere, I could not but by her. The other motive, why to public count I might not go, is the great love the general gender bear him. Now, note that both of these statements are true. It is true that Claudius is sending Hamlet away in part because he does not want Gertrude to know what he's planning. And it is true also that he loves Gertrude and cannot bear to see her aggrieved. And it is certainly true that he did not feel he could arrest Hamlet because of Hamlet's general popularity with the people who revere him. Now, while those are true, we might say it is also true when Claudius claims that he who hath your noble father slain also pursued my life. Yes, he knows that Hamlet has been plotting to kill him, it seems, and that also is true, and that's also a good reason for sending Hamlet away. So he offers then really three explanations for why he didn't arrest him, but rather expelled him. But he omits perhaps the deepest and most important reason for expelling Hamlet rather than arresting or trying him, and that is that he was afraid Hamlet would expose him as the murderer of King Hamlet. Now, as if Laertes were not already motivated enough to kill Hamlet, he has another reason when Ophelia comes in and he sees what Polonius's death, Hamlet's handiwork, though accidental, has done to his sister. When he comes in, he sees her and says, by heaven, thy madness shall be paid with weight. O heavens, is it possible a young maid's wits should be as mortal as an old man's life? The death of Polonius has killed his father, and it has killed his sister's mind. Now, at this moment of Laertes' maximum rage, a rage, in fact, so intense that he doesn't even ask for the circumstances under which Hamlet killed Polonius. So, in fact, he may not know that it was indeed meant to be a sword for Claudius. At this point, much to Claudius's astonishment and dismay, a message arrives from Hamlet. A note telling Claudius that, in fact, he is not dead, but that Hamlet is very much alive, and that he has landed, quote, naked, that is, destitute and alone, back on the shores of Denmark. This is not the news that Claudius had expected and hoped for, the news that they had killed Hamlet, as he anticipated and ordered, in England. Later, Hamlet tells Horatio the story of how this all came to be. First, suspecting that Claudius planned to have him assassinated in England, Hamlet tells him that he stealthily stole the letters ordering that assassination, forged a new letter allegedly from Claudius telling the English ruler to kill, instead, the carriers of that letter, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. He then, having forged the new letter, returned that to the packet with the official seal of the king to make it seem completely authentic and to make the English assume that it must, of course, come from Claudius himself. Here's what Hamlet says, interestingly, of that ability to impress on a forged document the official seal. He says, "Why, even in this there was heaven ordinate. I had my father's signet, a ring seal, in my purse, which was the model of the Danish seal." So it's still very much like the one that Claudius continues to use. Note the phrase that he uses there, heaven's ordinate. Hamlet is convinced upon his return that God arranged for him to be able to validate the forged letter with the king's signet stamp. In this detail and others, Hamlet sees that God wanted him to save his own life, to subvert Claudius's plot, to destroy Rosencrantz and Guildenstern instead, and ultimately to kill Claudius. Hamlet tells Horatio that he discovered the hand of God not just in this detail, but in everything. Thus, as he puts it, there's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. Even though we may not understand what our destiny is and may at times even try to violate it, there is a destiny. We may be roughly confused about what God has planned for us, but Hamlet now feels sure that there is indeed a plan for him ordained by God. This is Hamlet's transcendental discovery, one that he could only come to outside the prison of Denmark, which also, in leaving, has freed him from the prison of his own mental isolation. Hamlet now senses that there is a Godhead above him, beyond him. He senses now the presence of an ultimate other, so that his entire sense of reality is not completely solipsistically contained within his own subjective mind. In short, Hamlet, on his return, is no longer haunted by the vortex of his churning thoughts and at night by his, quote, bad dreams. And as a result, when Hamlet comes back in Act 5, as we'll see, he no longer speaks to himself as he did in 6 soliloquies in the first 4 acts of the play. He spoke in soliloquy in large part because he struggled so often to communicate openly with anyone else and was so trapped in his morbid solitude, unable to be sure about what he saw and indeed at times about whether the material world as he experienced it even really existed. But Hamlet's sense of a providential design that shapes his life seems to have grown even stronger while he was away, when pirates stopped and boarded the England-bound ship, enabling Hamlet, as he explains, to escape and thus find his way back to Denmark. From Hamlet's perspective, the arrival of these pirates, who treated him well, wasn't just an accident. Now, in announcing his imminent arrival at Elsinore in his note to Claudius, Hamlet begins that note, interestingly, by referring to Claudius as high and mighty, flattering Claudius, and thereby putting him immediately off guard. Claudius is suspicious enough of Hamlet. Now, with this, he's even more uncertain. Now, Claudius has no idea why Hamlet is still alive, or why he is taking what seems in this note to be a conciliatory tone, but he certainly doesn't trust his nephew, nor does Hamlet expect him to. So Claudius proposes to use Laertes as the means to kill Hamlet, both for his own sake, but also, he tells Laertes, for your sake, because he is the killer of your father. Now, like a kind of master tactician, Claudius then, simultaneously as he proposes this, stokes Laertes' rage against Hamlet, and at the same time convinces the tempestuous, impetuous Laertes to choose the right moment and the right occasion for this killing, which he will then momentarily propose. He says that when Hamlet comes back, what would you undertake to show yourself indeed your father's son? More than words, I'll cut his throat, I'll cut his throat. Yes, fine. But he suggests, hold back a little bit, hold back. And it's crucial then that he points out that sometimes we can do ourselves in by moving too quickly. So one must choose the right opportunity. And you'll note that in explaining this, they together will formulate a scheme. And one that in this cogitation led on largely by Claudius, it seems sure that Hamlet must die. First, Claudius suggests challenging Hamlet to a fencing match, because Hamlet takes pride in his skill with a rapier, and apparently was envious when he heard reports of Laertes' reputation as a fencer when Laertes was in Paris. Now, while Hamlet's rapier will have a blunt point on it, as in fencing, Laertes, Claudius says, will not. It will be sharp, and therefore, while he will not hurt you when he touches you with the rapier, yours will allow you to run him through. So with ease or with a little shuffling, you may choose a sword unbaited, and in passive practice requite him by your father. Okay? Now, that seems dangerous enough. But then, as insurance, Laertes proposes a backup, poisoning the tip of this sharp rapier, just in case he only wounds Hamlet with it. Now, the idea that it is going to be poison, again, reminds us that poison, both literal as a substance and moral as a form of evil and deception, both of those modes of poison, real and figurative, originated with Claudius and have spread throughout the play to others, now to Laertes. Claudius knows that Hamlet is a skilled fencer, so he readily agrees to this backup plan, the poisoning, and then proposes a third safeguard just to make sure that Hamlet dies, and that is, I will poison a drink, and when Hamlet, during a break, takes a swig, he will die. Now, Claudius is going to later go even further by putting a pearl in that goblet that Hamlet is to drink from, and telling Hamlet that if and when he drinks, he will get the pearl, thus a more potent inducement still. Finally, as if all of this were not enough, in order to induce Hamlet to compete against Laertes, to spur him into this dangerous trap, Claudius places a bet on Hamlet. He bets that Laertes, despite his acquired skill in France, cannot touch Hamlet 3 times during the skirmish. Now, clearly, Claudius fears the returned Hamlet. He's desperate, more desperate than ever to see him dead, but he also respects Hamlet as a formidable enemy, thus the need for all of these layers of insurance. Now, in laying out this plan, Claudius emphasizes that although Laertes will in the process get his revenge, it is crucial that everyone who witnesses it, even Gertrude, will believe it is, quote, an accident. Now, accident becomes an important concept at this point in the play. The question of why things happen. Do they happen by chance, or is there some higher purpose, some higher design? Was it merely a happy accident that the pirates raided the ship Hamlet was on, allowing him to escape assassination? Well, no. Hamlet's answer to that question is clearly no. Unambiguously, it was the hand of God. But there's also the question of whether or not Ophelia's drowning is an accident or is it a suicide. Now, her madness and death are presented in the language of flowers, through which Ophelia expresses more than she could possibly sensibly explain in words alone, in anything like rational language, in her derangement. When Laertes sees her carrying various plants that she has picked, each one that she mentions and hands out has specific symbolic meanings that Ophelia certainly knows and that an Elizabethan audience would have understood. This begins with the herb that you're probably familiar with, rosemary. Ophelia, taking a sprig of rosemary and handing it out, says, "There's rosemary. That's for remembrance. Pray you, love, remember, remember." Now, that word remember reverberates throughout the entire play. The ghost told Hamlet to remember his words and remember that moment. Hamlet tells Gertrude to remember her sin. What does Ophelia want others to remember? Well, she wants them to remember, it seems, her dead father, but also perhaps to remember what she once was when Polonius was alive and she was in love with and believed in Hamlet's love. Remember what I was, remember what I am now, afterward. She seems have enough lucidity perhaps to make that suggestion. But note here that she also distributes another herb called rue, and the name itself identifies this as a symbol of Ophelia's own rue, that is, her regret, her deep, deep sadness. And she ends this distribution of flowers and plants with violets, which are a symbol of fidelity, of faithfulness. But her father's death and Hamlet's cruelty and apparent withdrawal of love have robbed Ophelia of her faith in everything. That's why she says, "I would give you violets, but they are all withered when my father died." Now, Ophelia dies when she is near a river, gathering still more flowers and herbs. We don't see it, but we get the report that Gertrude hears. And Gertrude then reports it herself. Ophelia has made a coronet of flowers, wild flowers, around her head. And while reaching for these plants and more, she fell into the water and drowned, but in a most curious way. We're told, the queen says, "There is a willow grows askant the brook that shows his hoar leaves in the glassy stream. Therewith fantastic garlands did she make of corn, crowflowers, nettles, daisies, and long purples, that literal shepherds give a grosser name, but our cold maids do dead men's fingers call them. There on the pendant boughs her crownet weeds, clamoring to hang, an envious sliver broke, when down her weedy trophies and herself fell into the weeping brook. Her clothes spread wide, and her mermaid-like a while they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old lauds as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and imbued unto that element. But long it could not be, till that her garments heavy with their drink pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death." As she was holding on to a willow tree and picking flowers, she fell into the water and drowned. Now, 250 years after Hamlet was written, Victorian artists, particularly the pre-Raphaelite artists in the middle of the 19th century, were so fascinated with this scene in the play that several prominent ones painted it, the most famous of which is the canvas by Millet that I attached with the link to this lecture, and you should have a look at. But before her drowning, Ophelia seems to be drowning already in her own tears. As Laertes says, "Too much water hast thou, poor Ophelia." Yes, she's deeply depressed to the point of madness. But was her death an accident or a kind of passive suicide? Well, it's ambiguous because it comes to us only, of course, in a second-hand report, what Gertrude has heard from a messenger, okay? Now, on one hand, Ophelia seems to have fallen rather than jumped from the precipice overlooking the stream, and she was so deranged as to be unaware of her own distress, to be unaware of the danger of her situation as she drifted downstream singing to herself. These things would argue against any suicidal intention. But on the other hand, Ophelia was, as noted, depressed and grief-stricken to the point of madness, so that perhaps she didn't want to resist the downward pull of her sodden garments as they drew her down to muddy death. Well, the question of Ophelia's intention proves to be a major concern, because when Act 5 opens, we find two gravediggers discussing it. The gravediggers are preparing Ophelia's grave, And they discuss the unusual conditions of her internment following an inquest by a coroner. And they also note the widespread rumors about whether or not she committed suicide. As they put it, her death was doubtful. Indeed. One gravedigger asks, how is it, quote, she is to be buried here in Christian burial when she willfully seeks her own salvation? If the rumors are right and she took her own life, she sought heaven on her own, though suicide would not bring her heaven, but sought salvation from the agony of her depression through death, how is it then, as a suicide, she would be allowed to be buried in our church cemetery? Because suicide, of course, is one sin in which we cannot confess, in which we cannot in any way atone. The suicide dies unconfessed in a state of mortal sin, and the church forbade, therefore, both burial of suicide victims on ecclesiastical grounds and refused religious ceremonies for them. Thus, the reference here to the maimed rites, so-called, of Ophelia's simple and hasty burial. The gravediggers attribute the fact that Ophelia is being interred in the churchyard at all to political influence. One of them says, if she had not been a gentlewoman, that is, if she wasn't well connected at court, she would never be able to be buried here on hallowed ground, if indeed, as people believe, she took her own life. But political influence can only go so far. While the church, under pressure, seems to be permitting her to lie buried in holy ground, they have refused Ophelia the liturgy of a funeral, thus the maimed rites, because they suspect that she took her own life. These maimed rites incense Laertes even more because he had already noted the indignity of his father's obscure burial. And now, consider what he says to the doctor. The doctor says, we should profane the service of the dead to sing a requiem and such rest to her as to peace-parted souls, to which Laertes says, lay her in the earth, and from her fair and unpolluted fresh may violets spring, picking up her trope of flowers. I tell thee, churlish priest, a ministering angel shall my sister be when thou liest howling. Yes, when the priest lies howling in hell, my sister will be in heaven no matter what the church may say. Now, in remembrance of Ophelia, as she's being buried, Gertrude scatters flowers on Ophelia's gravesite and says, I hope thou shouldst have been my Hamlet's wife. Now, this is the first we've heard of that particular intention, but we suspect that that hope on Gertrude's part probably dates back to the time when King Hamlet was still alive, before Gertrude's sexual betrayal and before Hamlet's fall into terrible melancholy. Well, as the gravediggers shovel the earth, one of them throws up the skulls of the previously deceased. Now, it was a practice in Shakespeare's time to inter the dead in the same plots where many other bodies had been buried. The gravedigger jokes with his friend that he builds something that is stronger than what a shipwright or a carpenter could make, because he says, quote, the houses he makes last till doomsday. That is, by house he means the hole where the body is to be placed is a house, and it will last until doomsday, until the end of the world, where all other things that are built decay. One of the things that decays are coffins themselves. The wood, in Shakespeare's time, would rot. Indeed, the gravedigger says the water seeps into the earth, into the ground, and it rots the coffin. And as he tells Hamlet, it also rots the bodies themselves. They decay through this process. Now, thus, what he digs up are bones, presumably from coffins that have disintegrated, in bodies that have disintegrated. Now, this entire scene is full of graveyard humor, as skull after skull is tossed up from the pit that is being dug for Ophelia. Now, in death, skulls, of course, look very much the same, whether the deceased is a politician or a lawyer or a pauper, and the gravedigger makes this point. Well, when Hamlet enters with Horatio, having just arrived back from his voyage, and he sees these bones being disinterred, Hamlet asks, "Did these bones cost no more the breeding, but to play at logats with them? Mine ache to think on it." To paraphrase that line, Hamlet asks, it says, "I would hate to think that these lives, as manifest in the bones, were created for no other reason than for you to toss them up in digging a new grave." Now, the Hamlet that we saw before his transformative journey would have embraced this dark view of life as absurd. The idea that life is worth nothing more ultimately than having our bones tossed up after we die. But things have changed. And the Hamlet who jokes about death now with the gravedigger reveals how he has changed. Hamlet, remember, has discovered that there is a divine purpose and pattern in creation that gives meaning to life and meaning to what we do in it. Now, there are hints of this pattern in the world that seem to reflect God's design that Hamlet could not see before when he was in Denmark. For example, when Hamlet asks how long the gravedigger has been at his job, the gravedigger makes this remark. He says, "Of all the days in the year, I came to it the day that our last king Hamlet overcame Fortinbras." Hamlet says, "How long is that since?" And he says, "Cannot tell you that. Every fool can tell it. It was the very day that young Hamlet was born." Let's consider that for a moment. The gravedigger began work the day Hamlet was born, which seems to have coincided with the king, his father's defeat of Fortinbras, and acquisition of the land. Now, one implication of this coincidence of dates is that from the time of his birth, Hamlet was destined to meet this gravedigger because this will also be the day of his own death, as indeed it proves to be. We are born to die, as Shakespeare says elsewhere, we are born astride the grave, so to speak. But these are ideas that Hamlet had considered earlier in the play and lamented. They seem to make life itself pointless. But his tone and attitude have now changed as he discusses these same things. He can now look at the fact of death without a personal fear of an afterlife that would torment him. He can look at death without a sense that the very fact of death itself renders all human life and activity meaningless. In his earlier depressive state, both of those things preyed on him. You recall that the earlier Hamlet had expressed that idea of death as rendering human life absurd when he said that we eat only so that we can ultimately be eaten by worms. But his attitude now in this graveyard is quite different. The thought of death, both personal and collective, no longer torments and haunts him. Nor, for that matter, does it in any way tempt him. We see this change when the gravedigger identifies one of the exhumed skulls as that of the jester Yorick, whom Hamlet loved as a child. Consider Hamlet's famous remarks. "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination it is. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning, quite chapfallen, as the jaw has fallen off the skull." Well, in this moment, as he holds Yorick's skull, Hamlet literally and figuratively looks death in the face. In fact, he smells death and decay, phew, he says, as he addresses the remains of the dead jester. But contemplating this grinning skull doesn't fill Hamlet with horror or dread, nor with a desire to be dead himself, but rather it moves him to a recollection of playing with Yorick as a child, of his love for the jester, and to regret and a sense of loss but to an acceptance of death. And the emphasis is on his love ultimately here more than it is on the loss. Well, Hamlet's discovery of providence now allows him then to face death and to look beyond it without terror, without dread, without confusion. And we see this change a moment later. Hamlet jokes with Horatio that through the process of bodily decay, the remains of Alexander might be used to plug a hole in a beer barrel. He says, Alexander was buried. Alexander returneth thus to dust. The dust is earth. Of earth we make loam. And why that loam whereto he was converted, might they not stop a beer barrel? Imperious Caesar, dead and turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. Yes. Now, note that unlike Hamlet's earlier remarks on death, in his antic disposition about bodies feeding worms, his tone here is more playful, whereas before it had been bitterly ironic. Hamlet asks, whose grave are you digging? But the gravedigger says only that it is one that was a woman before she died. It's only when Hamlet sees them bringing the coffin does he realize that the grave's for Ophelia, the woman that he loved and the woman that he injured. We can only imagine the intense burden of guilt and grief that Hamlet feels at this moment. But his behavior is indeed most peculiar, and I think it presents one of the most mystifying scenes in the play. Hamlet sees the distraught Laertes, Ophelia's brother, tell the gravedigger to, quote, hold off the earth till I have caught her once more in my arms. And Hamlet then watches Laertes, in his grief, leap into the grave and embrace the corpse of his dead sister. Well, Hamlet's response is to challenge Laertes in a kind of competition of grief, thereby seeming to mock and diminish Laertes' own deep and genuine sorrow. Hamlet says, why, I will fight with him upon this theme of death until my eyelids will no longer wag. I loved Ophelia. 40,000 brothers could not with all their quantity of love make up my sum. What wilt thou do for her? Swoons, show me what that will do. Won't weep, won't fight, won't fast. Whoa! Drink up an easel? Will you eat a crocodile? What are you going to do? This is not an appealing moment for Hamlet. It seems deeply insensitive, does it not, to treat a grieving man this way, a man whose father and sister have just died as a result of Hamlet's own actions, though neither of them intentional? Well, what causes this erratic behavior in a Hamlet who otherwise seems calm and reflective and confident? Well, looking back on it, Hamlet seems to support Gertrude's claim that this is a moment of madness, because when he apologizes for his conduct to Laertes, he says that it was, quote, my madness at that moment in which, quote, Hamlet from himself was taken away. Again, we're reminded that one can lose a sense of who one is, even when Hamlet has discovered a far fuller basis for knowing who he is. But that phrase, Hamlet from himself was taken away, sounds a bit too much like the old Hamlet, the pre-voyage Hamlet, not the one who has returned with a clearer understanding of himself and his destiny. So I think we might not be entirely confident that Hamlet in that moment believes he was really mad. But it was certainly a departure from the Hamlet that we see otherwise in Act 5 of the play. Hamlet, indeed, in Act 5, seems to know who he is. He knows himself well enough, in fact, to recognize himself in this brief aberration as unlike himself. But why does he behave this way, after all? Was it to appear mad? Well, that had earlier been a strategy of self-protection, but no. After Hamlet returns, he doesn't perpetuate his antic disposition any longer. So it's not that he's trying to look insane. I think the closest we come to a coherent explanation if we reject the idea that this momentary outburst was in any way actual madness, the most coherent explanation, I think, comes in a remark that Hamlet makes to Horatio, looking back upon it, when he says, "I am very sorry, good Horatio, that to Laertes I forgot myself. For by the image of my cause I see the portraiture of his. I'll court his favors, but sure the bravery of his grief did put me into a toe-ring position." What does he mean by this? Well, seeing Laertes enact his grief so openly, Hamlet felt grief for his own father as well as for Ophelia. And Hamlet says he identifies at that moment so fully with Laertes that he momentarily lost his emotional self-control. As he puts it, "I forgot myself." That's not really madness, but that phrase, "forgot myself," indicates that Hamlet now knows who he is well enough to be able to recognize that at a moment like this, he's not behaving as the self he knows himself to be. He's behaving aggressively, but his aggression here against Laertes seems paradoxically rooted in the fact that he identifies with Laertes. And it's this: he sees Laertes expressing his grief for his dead father so openly, and for Ophelia so openly and powerfully, and he's aware that he, Hamlet, has had, up until now, to repress the depth of his own anguish for his dead father. It's as if in the extreme behavior Hamlet engages in, challenging Laertes and suggesting that I can grieve even more ostentatiously than you, it's as if in that moment Hamlet is discharging or exorcising all the pent-up grief that he felt for his father that he couldn't openly express earlier. He is, in a sense, then, jealous that Laertes is able to express that grief so fully and openly and naturally. And now Hamlet, in some ways, overdoes it. But in recognizing that he and Laertes have both lost their fathers and both grieve Ophelia, Hamlet is using Laertes here as a kind of mirror, as a way of seeing himself more clearly through these similarities, but also through the differences in how they are allowed or have been allowed to express their grief. Now, it is appropriate, if you think of it, that Laertes and Hamlet will later fight with foils, that is, rapiers or fencing swords, because Shakespeare plays on the concept of their characters throughout the play as foils for one another. In fact, as they're just about to begin the joust, Hamlet says to Laertes, "I'll be your foil, Laertes," and Laertes is certainly Hamlet's foil. Now, insulted by Hamlet's bizarre behavior at Ophelia's gravesite, Laertes is ready to kill Hamlet right there and then, notwithstanding the plan that Laertes and Claudius have hatched. He's so incensed at Hamlet's behavior and at his belief that Hamlet is responsible for Ophelia and Polonius's death that he tries to strangle him. To which Hamlet then says, "I prithee thee, take thy fingers from my throat, for though I am not splenitive and rash, yet have I in me something dangerous, which let thy wisdom fear. Hold off thy hand." What is Hamlet referring to when he says that he has something dangerous within him that Laertes should wisely fear and beware? Is it the dangerous knowledge of Claudius's guilt? How would that endanger Laertes, unless Hamlet senses that Laertes is in league with or under Claudius's control? I think it's more likely that Hamlet is here referring, when he talks about something dangerous in himself, to his knowledge that God has appointed him to enact justice, and that Laertes, if he's not careful, could be a casualty of that divine plan. Now, Laertes seems perhaps to sense this danger, because after all, when the king says, "Pluck them asunder," they're parted, and Laertes makes no more of it. He seems to release his grip. Why does Hamlet agree to fence with Laertes, given his antagonism to an individual who he knows would like to kill him, and given his deep distrust of Claudius, here's how he explains it to Horatio. Let the foils be brought, the gentleman willing, and the king hold his purpose. I will win for him, if I can. If not, I will gain nothing but my shame and the odd hits. No, I will follow the king's pleasure. If his fitness speaks, mine is ready, now or whensoever provided. Now, note, because everything that happens in life, Hamlet believes, is overseen by a providential design, by a beneficent and all-seeing creator, there is pattern and purpose in everything that happens. And as a consequence, Hamlet can explain there is divinity even in the fall of a sparrow. But consider here for a moment that he plans to act, that he plans to participate in this exhibition that the king has arranged, because he knows that he will eventually kill Claudius in an act of judgment, and that he can therefore act and move through life without either urgency or fear. He's no longer tormenting himself because he hasn't yet killed Claudius as he'd done before. And the key word that he uses in explaining his willingness to engage in the duel is, I am ready. That is a word that he will repeat. Ready. He's ready when the assigned time comes, a time assigned by God. The specific occasion when he will kill Claudius is in God's hand. And he makes that even clearer later in the conversation with Horatio, when he says, there is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all, since no man of aught he leaves knows what isn't to leave betimes. Let be. Now, because every specific occasion is ultimately in God's hands, because everything happens overseen by a providential design, there is a purpose even in the fall of a sparrow, let alone the execution of a king. But we cannot know what God has planned for us, as Hamlet makes clear, from our limited position on earth, since no man of aught knows, and therefore one must simply be ready for whatever God assigns us. And it's clear then that for Hamlet there is a pattern and a purpose, though we cannot see it, in what looks to be human chaos. There's an underlying order in human life, but one that it took Hamlet a voyage away in order to discover. Man's task, as Hamlet explains it, is to accept and act in accordance with God's plan, to be ready, if not now, then, rather than trying to force his will onto the world. Thus, essentially, when he concludes, let be, Hamlet means let life take its course. Later, in the same spirit of accepting God's design and his role in it, Hamlet will use that phrase made famous by the Beatles, let it be. He no longer needs to watch Claudius anxiously, trying to plot and plan a moment to strike. That's out of his hands. All that matters is the readiness to act in accordance with God's will at the moment God provides the opportunity. He's at peace then, Hamlet is, because he realizes that the decision-making is beyond his will. This is why he no longer feels that the revenge killing is such a terrible burden that he must bear. Before, you remember, he described it as a terrible obligation, as a source of dread, as a curse that he needed to set right. No longer, because he feels he's not acting alone in this. Now, on his return, Hamlet is also, apparently, at peace with other demons that had taunted him before, but which he seems now to have subdued. It's not just, as I've noted, his doubts about the value and purpose of human existence or confusion about who he is, but other demons as well. For example, Hamlet has apparently moved beyond his preoccupation with his mother's sexuality. Now, when he sees Gertrude with Claudius, he no longer rails silently to himself against their incestuous union. And he is also now beyond his earlier propensity, it seems, for guilty brooding. While Hamlet surely does feel guilty and must feel guilty at the sight of Ophelia's coffined body, he doesn't lacerate himself for causing her death, as he certainly would have earlier. As he approaches the duel with Laertes, in fact, Hamlet is almost serene. Now, during the duel, Gertrude is so supportive and so pleased at Hamlet's return that she offers to wipe her son's sweaty forehead with her handkerchief. She's rooting for him so hard that in celebration of the two, quote, palpable hits that Hamlet, who is an adept fencer, lands on Laertes' body, to celebrate that, Gertrude drinks from the poisoned cup that was meant for Hamlet. Claudius sees this and in an aside says, "It's too late." Unlike Claudius, who has lived by deception since he killed the king and blamed it on a venomous snake bite, Laertes doesn't like participating in dishonesty, even though he had been complicit in arranging it. So as Laertes prepares to strike Hamlet with the poison-tipped, unblunted rapier, he says that such deceit, quote, is almost against my conscience. Yeah. And when Laertes and Hamlet wound each other with the poisoned foil in their scuffle, Laertes says immediately afterward, "I am justly killed with my own treachery." Now, within 10 minutes of stage time, depending on the length of the rapier duel, 4 deaths occur on stage. Violent deaths by laceration and poisoning that we would never see occurring, of course, in a Greek theater. They would all be off stage and reported. Gertrude dies first, crying, the drink, I am poisoned." Laertes then dies of the poisonous wound that he received from Hamlet when, in their scuffle, first he wounded Hamlet with the poison rapier, and then Hamlet appropriated it almost by accident. Of course, it's not accident, it's obviously God's will, and wounds Laertes. But note that before he dies, Laertes confesses his deceit and asks Hamlet to, quote, exchange forgiveness with me, end quote. That is, forgive me for taking your life and using deceit to do it, and I will forgive you for causing or in any way being a causal force in the deaths of my father and sister. Now, Laertes also makes an accusation just as he is expiring, and it is a just one. Quote, the king is to blame. Indeed, he is. Claudius used Laertes as an instrument in his attempt to kill Hamlet, but more broadly, he is to blame for initiating the poisoning of Denmark when he poured that vial into King Hamlet's ear. As we've seen, the spread of that poison now justly claims Claudius's own life when Hamlet stabs him with the same untipped poisoned rapier with which he and Laertes have fatally wounded each other. Unlike Laertes, who admits his guilt before dying, and as we've seen asks Hamlet's forgiveness, Claudius does neither. In the face of Laertes' accusations, he simply cries, "Defend me, friends, for I am hurt." He has no friends. A moment later, he dies. Just as we saw Claudius was unable to pray earlier, so too, even at the moment of his death, he seems incapable of confession or remorse. Now, the fourth and final body that loads the stage is, of course, Hamlet's own. And as he lies dying, Hamlet offers tantalizing words to Horatio about what caused his transformation, but then breaks off, leaving us to wonder what it was that revealed God's design to him first or most fully, just as we later wonder when his final words are, "The rest is silence." What would he speak if he didn't have to be silenced by death? Consider what he says to Laertes as he is dying. "Had I but time, as this fell sergeant Death is strict in his arrest, oh, I could tell you, but let it be, Horatio. I am dead, thou livest. Report me and my cause aright to the unsatisfied. If thou didst ever hold me in thy heart, absent thee from felicity a while, and in this harsh world draw thy breath in pain to tell my story." Now, note that this injunction to Horatio to tell his story comes at the same time when he is already gratified at having fulfilled both his father's and apparently God's injunction to enforce justice by taking the life of Claudius. But note, too, that at the very end, he also tells his friend Horatio that he wants him to remember him. And as he says, tell my story. The ghost had told Hamlet to remember. Hamlet had told Gertrude to remember. Now Hamlet effectively tells, on his deathbed, Horatio to remember. But he doesn't explain what triggered his transformation. And just before Hamlet expires, his final words again lay emphasis upon this. He says, "Oh, I die, Horatio. The potent poison quite o'ercrowns my spirit. I cannot live to hear the news from England, but I do prophesy the election lights on Fortinbras. He has my dying voice, so tell him with occurrence more and less, which have solicited. The rest is silence." Again, Hamlet seems as if he would like to say more, but as he says, "Ah, Horatio, there are things that I could tell thee, but let it be. Let it be." This final prophecy that Hamlet offers, that the young Fortinbras will, with his support, be crowned the King of Denmark, is both fitting and ironic. It goes back, of course, to the fact that at the time of Hamlet's birth, King Hamlet slew in hand-to-hand combat Fortinbras's father and acquired contested land. Now you recall Fortinbras is off fighting the Poles, but on his way back from his victorious campaign there, he's been given permission to cross through Denmark, as he did when he was going. And thus he turns up at the end of the play, as Hamlet had prophesied, though Hamlet dies too early to get the news that comes at the same time that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead because of Hamlet's forged letter. Now, there are two eulogies pronounced on Hamlet after his death. The first comes from Horatio, who commends the angels to take Hamlet to eternal rest, because Horatio is sure that Hamlet's soul will go to heaven. But then the young Fortinbras pays Hamlet, a man he never really knew, the remarkable respect of insisting that Hamlet be buried as a soldier. "Let 4 captains bear Hamlet like a soldier to the stage, for he was likely, had he been put on, to have proved most royal, and for his passage the soldier's music and the right of war speak loudly for him." Now, there is something in Hamlet that Fortinbras respects, though he knows him very little, and believes that if Hamlet had become king, he would have been perhaps a great warrior and a great leader. Thus he deserves this military funeral. But we recall that Hamlet's father, when he appeared at the beginning of the play, was arrayed in armor, though he certainly didn't die in armor, and had passed on to Hamlet the command to wage war against Claudius. Okay? Thus, in a certain sense, Hamlet has been waging war as a soldier, if you will, against the villainous Claudius, and has finally succeeded, but at the cost of his own life. But the honor of a soldier's solemn funeral is more appropriate than Fontainebleau knows, because Hamlet, after all, has struggled valiantly, not just against Claudius in their private war, but he's also struggled against himself, against his doubts, against his own desire to die, against his metaphysical confusion, against his profound depression. Well, before leaving the play, I want to think about Hamlet in relation to Aristotle's concept of a hamartia. That is, you remember, a fatal mistake that Aristotle says tragic protagonist makes, often caused by some inner flaw or imperfection. Well, what is Hamlet's mistake in this play, his error in judgment? Perhaps not killing Claudius when he saw him praying and imagined he really was. If he had killed him then, he would have sent his soul to hell and fulfilled his obligation. But that mistake, if you will, that missed opportunity, didn't derive from a flaw. Despite what Hamlet may say to himself, he isn't a coward and he doesn't deceive himself. Now, it's interesting that in Shakespeare's other tragedies, we do find what we have come to call tragic flaws, and they are readily apparent. In King Lear, it's Lear's overweening vanity. In Macbeth, it's Macbeth's unbridled ambition. In Othello, as we'll see, it's Othello's jealousy and impatience. But it's hard to find such a weakness in Hamlet. Yes, you could argue he thinks too much and he thinks too deeply, but I think most readers and most viewers would say that those are actually his greatest strengths that make him most compelling and most deeply human. Which isn't to say that Hamlet is perfect. He is, as I've noted, crueler to Ophelia than he needs to be in order to try to free her from loving him. And it's true also that Hamlet's preoccupation with Gertrude's sex life is so morbid that too seems to taint his character. But neither his treatment of Ophelia nor of Gertrude contribute in any direct way to his death. Also, unlike all other Shakespeare's tragic heroes who fall from fortune and power into misfortune, Hamlet goes the other direction. He begins in a state of deep depression and confusion and powerlessness, but dies after killing Claudius triumphantly. He fulfills his father's command. He enacts justice also by obeying and fulfilling the will of God in the moment that God has given him that opportunity. Now, unlike Electra, who is, I suppose, closest to Hamlet in this reverse pattern of moving from bad fortune to good, unlike Electra, it's also notable that Hamlet's killing of Claudius doesn't morally taint him the way her overzealous and almost depraved response to Clytemnestra's death seemed to degrade her morally. Well, Hamlet, as I hope you now recognize, is an absolutely inexhaustible play. You can return to it a dozen times during the course of your life and find always something new and fascinating and mysterious on each reading, on each new viewing. Now, the upcoming lecture, which is going to be on film versions of Hamlet that I think you'll very much enjoy, is going to give you a sense of the interpretive range that this play commands. I'll be sending you a link to that guest lecture on Monday night. Okay?